Now, I think one rule I would very much advise people to abide by is do not piss on the chips of the Good Law Project, because now, I mean, if the government, I would say, not to get too graphic, have clearly soaked the chips of the Good Law Project with bodily fluids. Let's just leave it there. Let's just see what's happened in terms of what the Good Law Project. This huge win, and this is what we're going to talk about with Ellie. I'm going to talk about the party and the huge fury and anger across the country. But even though it's understandable that people are more angry about Partygate, I think in a very real sense, this is a bigger scandal, because this is about the corruption of the British state. So the High Court's just found the government PPE VIP Lane for politically connected supplies was unlawful. Once again, another win for the Good Law Project. They must hate you by this point. Just explain what was the case and what's been found.
So in October, we uncovered the existence of a VIP lane. We were leaked some private government documents, which we published. We couldn't get any of the media actually to pick them up. Everyone was so startled at what the documents seemed to show, which was the institutionalization of a special regime that applied to those who the National Audit Office found were overwhelmingly referred by the offices of ministers. Putting it more briefly, if you were an associate of a minister, and you might be an associate of a minister because you're a pal, or you're a donor, or you have shared business interests, you got put into a special lane, and you got treated differently. And what the National Audit Office later went on to find was that you were much more than 10 times more likely to win a PPE contract. So we found this stuff in October 2020. We published it. We couldn't get anyone to pick it up because it just was astonishing then to the media that there would be a kind of institutionalization of party privilege in the handing out of substantial sums of money. I mean, very, very substantial sums of money. So Private Eye, I think, have indicated that, and they've seen materials, I haven't seen the materials, that on one transaction, it's something like 80 million quid of profit was made. And this was a transaction through the VIP lane. We were pretty startled by this. We brought a series of procurement cases, some of which are still working their way through the courts. But what the court held yesterday was that the VIP lane was not only immoral, not only unethical, but also illegal. And we see that as being a vindication of a very long campaign that Good Law Project has fought, both in the public domain and in the courts.
Is this corruption?
Corruption is a funny word, actually. It doesn't really have to a lawyer, it doesn't really have a term of art meaning. I think I would say that corruption is whenever a public servant allows private interests to interfere with her or with his exercise of their duties as a public servant. Looked in that way, bearing in mind that the architects of the VIP lane gave unfair advantage to those referred into the lane by overwhelmingly by the offices of Conservative Party ministers. I think it can be described as corruption, meeting that definition. I mean, there's another way to look at it as well, which is that the National Audit Office also identified that there was and here I quote, a high risk of fraud in PPE pandemic procurement. I mean, there's a VIP lane we uncovered for PPE, and £12.5 billion was spent on PPE, albeit not all through the VIP lane. There's also a VIP lane for test and trace, and £37 billion was spent on the test and trace debacle. So that's a total of 50 billion quid, 2 VIP lanes. We don't know how much of that 50 went through the VIP lanes, but it will have been in the high single or double digit billions. Very, very substantial sums of money have been spent in a way that prefers associates of the Conservative Party. And, I think that is quite staggering stuff. I mean, the reality of the situation is this, really. One of the reasons why we have elaborate processes around the spending of vast sums of public money is because human nature is what it is. And when vast sums of public money that can, to some people, feel ownerless, in other words, if I get some of it, it doesn't come out of anyone's pocket, so it's not really stealing. When vast sums of public money are flying around, you need a careful process to secure that it goes, or at least it has the highest chances possible of going to the right place. In a pandemic, inevitably, you cut the process to achieve speed. You decide that speed is more important than protecting against fraud. And fraud is inevitable. And I think all of that is true. But what's really shocking to me about what's happened in the UK is that although several bodies in government have said that there is, well, one said there's a high risk of fraud, the other said they couldn't rule out fraud in PPE procurement, nobody has bothered to look. No one has thought to ask the question, no one in authority at any rate, whether prosecutions should be brought. So, there's fraud in Germany, there's fraud in the States, there's fraud in Italy around pandemic procurement. Fraud is what happens when you put aside those safeguards. But as far as I'm aware, it's only in the UK where our establishment has turned a blind eye. I mean, in a funny way, that's the thread that draws together the two big stories of yesterday, the Met turning a blind eye to the criminality, as I also see it, of the Prime Minister, and the establishment turning a blind eye to criminality in the procurement of pandemic PPE.
That's the other thing I wanted to ask you about the police. I mean, just quickly on what you said about a PPE crisis. Never again should any government treat a public health crisis as an opportunity to enrich its associates and donors at public expense, which of course is exactly what's happened. Whatever people label that, that is a very succinct and damning description of what's happened. That's the other thing I wanted to talk to you about. So not long before we start this conversation, the Metropolitan Police have issued a statement which essentially makes it clear that they don't think there's enough evidence. They don't think there's enough evidence. Sorry, I just need to compose myself. They don't think there's enough evidence to investigate whether the Prime Minister has broken the rules, when the Prime Minister obviously made a statement which, however gaslit he thinks the nation is, makes it clear he broke the rules and his officials broke the rules. Now, the Metropolitan Police, I mean, why should they have known what was happening in number 10 Downing Street? It's not like they've got several police officers parked there. As I noted before I started speaking to you, the police could be pretty zealous, overzealous with how they enforce lockdown rules. The Crown Prosecution Service found 3 in 10 cases had been incorrectly charged. They charged homeless people. They charged children, which was actually against the law. Now, given they were disproportionately, again, black people up to 7 times more likely to be fined. So they went for some of the communities, let's be honest, who were traditionally over-policed and harassed by the justice system. And yet there's no evidence, they say, to investigate not just one party, not two, multiple parties, including the Prime Minister. What the hell is going on? How is this possible? And what action did the Good Law Project take?
Yeah, there's a kind of fin de siècle to the end of 2020 if you're lucky enough to be working in Downing Street. They seem to have had more parties during lockdown than most of us get to go to in a normal year. What on earth were they doing? How did they find time to manage the pandemic? Maybe they weren't managing the pandemic. I mean, the Met's position is quite extraordinary because all of the facts that we need to determine whether or not a crime was committed on the 20th of May party are now in the public domain. The Prime Minister's admitted he was there. We know that about 30 people were there. We know that it was a bring your own booze occasion, trestle tables heaving with food. The only question is a question of law. Does that amount to a criminal offence? And I haven't looked at the legislation, but people who have seem to be unequivocally of the view that that is the commission of a criminal offence. But there's no deficiency of evidence. The only question really is one of legal analysis of the evidence. So I scratch my head at that. I also scratch my head at the notion, which seems to have crept into the Met's understanding of all of this, namely that their job is otherwise than gathering evidence. So, they're not the Crown Prosecution Service. It's not their job to assess evidence and bring a prosecution. They sit before that in the process. Their job is to gather evidence and put it before the CPS, and the CPS decides whether or not a prosecution should be brought. So they seem to be completely abrogating the role that the justice system, the criminal justice system, gives to them. And then, if all of that wasn't bad enough, the reality of the excuses that the Met have given for not investigating strike profoundly, or at least as I see them, at the notion of equality before the law. If you look at the Old Bailey, there's this great big gilded statue on top. The statue is of Lady Justice. She's holding a sword to indicate the sort of magnificence of the law, and scales to indicate that the law applies equally to everybody. And lots of other depictions of Lady Justice show her blindfolded. She does not care. She does not know who is before her. She applies the law equally to everybody. But the position that the Met is taking is extraordinary. So the Met say that because the Prime Minister's subordinate is carrying out an investigation, they, the Met, don't need to. But imagine if the Met knocked at your door, Mr. Jones, it's been reported to us that you committed a criminal offence, and we need to ask you some questions. Imagine if you said to them, don't worry, one of my interns is carrying out an independent investigation to the matters that you put before me, so you don't need to take an interest. My intern will report to me, and I'll report to you in due course. And then if the answer is that my intern thinks I did commit a criminal offence, you can take action. I mean, the Met would laugh at you, and they'd be right to laugh at you. So I don't understand how the Met can think that the involvement of Sue Gray gives them an excuse not to investigate. And the other answer that the Met have given to us is almost worse. The Met say, well, we've spoken to number 10, and number 10 assure us that no rules were broken, so we're not going to investigate. Same hypothesis again. The Met knock at your door. Mr. Jones, we think you may have committed a criminal offence. We'd like to ask you some questions. We'd like to look in your wardrobe to see if there's any stolen goods there. Don't worry, officer. I can assure you no rules were broken. You do not need to investigate. All right, says Plod, and off he trots. I mean, it's bizarre. And it's worse than bizarre, really, because what we're seeing is the application of one law, one regime to those who are influential, who are powerful, who are running the country, a different regime to the regime that applies to everyone else. And that's the point, really. It's the same point as in the VIP lane. And it's also, bizarrely, the same point as in another strand of work the Good Law Project's working on at the moment, which is Clause 9 of the Nationality and Immigration Bill, where government is creating a separate legal regime for those who have dual citizenship or may have dual citizenship, so their citizenship is contingent. And everywhere you look, you seem to find this institutionalization of privilege for the powerful.
Jolyon, that was a real masterclass. Obviously, if I was accused of a criminal offence, I would just blame Ellie Mayer Hagan, and I think that'd be pretty convincing. But that was a masterclass, which again, this just shows how critical the Good Law Project in terms of the work that you've done, because what you are doing is challenging these huge inequities, which, as you know, much of the media has ignored. You've ploughed on regardless. You've taken the government through the courts, and you've won, and you've exposed these horrific injustices. Fingers crossed with the Metropolitan Police, you have similar success, because again, what we see here is the Metropolitan Police coming down, crashing down on the backs, often in the most disproportionate way, of some of their usual targets, if we're honest, whilst washing their hands of any investigation of the way the people at the top have behaved who designed the rules. But that was brilliant. So well explained. What everyone must do, if you're watching this or listening to this, go and support the Good Law Project. I think if you just Google Good Law Project support, is that right?
Goodlawproject.org.
Yeah,
Thanks.
Good Law. Yeah, but I mean, just go to goodlawproject.org and just get whatever you can, everyone, because their work does depend on the support of ordinary people, whether it be fighting for trans rights or taking on the British government. So thank you so much, Joe. Honestly, that was brilliant, and I will speak to you soon.
A pleasure. Thanks, Owen. Bye for now.